All right, cool. Let's get into it here. Okay, so quickly, I do want to apologize. This first run through, I know it's a 15-minute minimum. My first run through ran about 39 minutes, so I'm going to try to cut a lot of stuff down, and it might seem like I'm rushing, but I'm going to just try to get through it and not explain, especially on slide 3. I've got a lot of stuff that I'm just going to go through real quick instead of explaining all the books. All right, so we've got Karl Marx, my philosopher presentation. I'm going to be covering Marxism, conflict theory, dialectical, and historical materialism. Okay. There we go. All right. So yeah, just a quick biographical background. First off, that's like a drawing that he had a friend do when he was in college. Yeah, so he lived from 1818 to 1883. He was married with at least 7 kids. I guess they weren't important enough to know exactly how many kids he had. He attended the University of Bonn or Bonn and the University of Berlin, and then he received his PhD from the University of Jena or Jena in 1841. Interestingly enough, he's always been very left leaning. He was an atheist, and the University of Berlin, where he was trying to get his PhD at, where he took classes. Before turning in his papers, he knew that he was going to be barred from academic research and studies and not get his PhD. So he actually turned in his thesis to the University of Jena or Jena. And without even taking classes there, he got his PhD there instead because he knew they were a little more left leaning. They'd be a little more forgiving for his PhD. So he got his PhD at a college he never attended. He was a member of the Young Hegelians or Hegelians. Yeah, Hegelians probably sound right. About 1837. So during those college years, they're really an atheistic group of Hegel followers. Hegel, famously Christian. I'll get into all of that stuff later. He was born in Germany, moved to Paris, where he met Engels. Funny enough, he met him in a cafe. Uh, a meeting of fates, I guess. He moved to Brussels for a couple years, and then he finally settled in London, which is where he did most of his work, and then would live there until 83, where he would pass away. He joined the Communist League in London. There's this weird idea that Marx invented communism. Even some people thinking he invented socialism. Not true. He joined already made groups. Communism was already an idea. Feudal communism already a thing. Socialism, early 1800s. There's the book The Socialist Utopia. Marx actually criticizes this book a lot. We'll get into it. Get into it later. Anyways, source of income, patronage from his collaborator Friedrich Engels, as well as he would write a lot of articles for local newspapers. Some would get picked up, some not. A lot of them too radical. So it was not a steady income for him. But nonetheless, so his family did live in extreme poverty. Um, Luckily, his collaborator Friedrich Engels, pretty wealthy man. His father was an industrialist, so multimillionaire in our time. So he funded Marx's research as well as collaborated on most of it. Contributions to philosophy. I'll get this out of here. Just a quote I have here from the Communist Manifesto. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their change. Their chains. Karl Marx, their change. His notable works: Communist Manifesto. Got Das Kapital. That's his mostly economics. This one he dives into conflict theory. Let's see, the German ideology. So that's where he's explaining. I wish I had a copy of it with me, but that's where he explains, dialectical and historical materialism. That's that big book. Value, Price, and Profit. He wrote this before Capital. It expands more on the labor value or the labor theory of value that I have over on the right side. Contribution to the critique of political economy. The Poverty of Philosophy. Pretty much a diss track, or it's a book basically complaining about anarchists, how they have this utopian idea of how the world would work. Um, he criticizes them for that. Funny enough, Nietzsche criticizes Marx for saying that he's ignoring human nature. Marx is also criticizing the anarchists for saying that they are ignoring how humans work. It's robots weren't a concept, but they have a system that only robots could live in. So he calls it the poverty of philosophy. They're not bringing philosophy and human nature into account. So that's that book about that. And then the address of the International Workerman's Association to Abraham Lincoln. Um, they were congratulating him on election, saying that this is a call to end slavery. Um, some people blow this out of proportion, saying that him and Lincoln were friends. We have one documented letter going back and forth from the two of them, so it's it's not as deep as people make it sound. But yeah, the communists of England at the time very against slavery. Important concepts. So we've got conflict theory. Again, in the manifesto, he spells it out. Dialectical materialism, historical materialism, Marxism. I'm going to explain all of these in the next 3 slides. But then you have labor theory of value. Basically, nothing has value without the labor that it takes to produce that thing. So your chair, if it took 15 minutes to put together and gather all the resources, is not worth as much as if the chair had taken weeks to put together by laborers, and to gather the materials. Basically, labor dictates price instead of supply and demand. Globalization, this idea that capitalism needs to spread, and it creates these economic channels that connect the world. So it has some good aspects, that he says that it's connecting society and all of this stuff, but that it needs to do that. So you've got a business that gets all the resources in one area, and then it gets all the resources in the state, and then in the country, and then expands. It's a multinational corporation. Globalization in today's age has been expanded to say we have billionaires trying to go to Mars for resources, is what they're saying, because capitalism needs to expand. Consolidation of capital. Him and Lenin in this book discuss how in free competition you have winners and losers. So there's no libertarian idea of the anarcho-capitalism where without regulation, prices would be kept low because of competition. He says competition dictates winners and losers. It presupposes that idea. As these winners grow bigger and bigger, they're going to win at increasingly high rates. And so you get monopoly, and they're going to take in more and more resources and capital until you've got this oligopoly of 5 businesses running the world is basically the idea of the consolidation of capital. All right, so we've got conflict theory. Move this down here. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. That is another quote from the Communist Manifesto. Conflict theory. So simply put, struggles for power create societal change. So things like the 40-hour work week, think no longer have child labor, workplace safety, stuff like that. That was all brought about by unions struggling against the upper class that controlled their lives, and creating societal change. So it was originally introduced by Marx, later adapted into intersectional feminism, queer theory, race conflict theories. Basically, they said instead of class, which was Marx's whole thing, he argues exploitation. They argue oppression. It's not super equal, but in the 1960s, they're writing about 100 years later. Men are holding women down. Straights are holding gays down. Whites are holding blacks down, and other races as well. But basically, they adapt his theory of exploitation into oppression, and say that that's what's wrong with the world instead of it being a class problem. Marxists kind of have an issue with that, but we'll ignore the Frankfurt School. He says with his conflict theory that working together towards an end goal rids civilization of natural constraints, but those lead to social constraints. So like feudalism and capitalism are these social restraints. So he says natural restraints. If you put us in the wilderness, we're not going to be as well adapted as a bear would to surviving, you know. So what humans did is they all got together, they created societies, we started farming, so we don't all have to individually hunt for our food, go collect our food. We live better. But in getting rid of these natural constraints, we created societal constraints or social constraints. So we've got feudalism. We've got one guy at the top getting all of the labor pushed up towards him. So you've got the feudal peasants doing all the work. There's an abundance of food. There's actually overproduction of food. And so you've got things like famines that just should not be happening anymore. We have enough food, but it's the allocation that's the problem. The food is going up the chain and not getting eaten by the people doing the work, the laborers. So that's his idea of social constraints. That's feudalism. Capitalism is really a profit. It's a profit incentivized form of feudalism, as Marxists would call it. Because of conflict theory, Marx argued that revolution towards an industrialized, classless society was inevitable. People like Lenin in State and Revolution thought that it was going to be immediate. So that's why you see the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union and the October Revolution. Revolution did happen, about 30 years after Marx's death. But it's the idea that because of conflict theory, because that's how society has always changed, it's the idea that it's going to keep happening, and we'll eventually be at this, not utopian, but close to it, of an industrialized classless society where everyone's needs are met. That's his theory. Okay, Marxism. Yeah, so did I skip? I don't know if I skipped a slide. I did. Sorry about that. Yeah. So we've got materialism. I'm going to have to explain materialism, idealism, Hegel's dialectics. I'm going to go through all of that. This was all laid out here in the German ideology, Marx's take on the materialism versus idealism debate. But you got materialism. So basically the idea that the material world causes the ideal world. So material conditions cause our thoughts, our ideas, our thoughts of God. Then you've got idealism, where the metaphysical, God and stuff comes first and causes the material world. Our thoughts cause the material world. This has its problems. Not going to get into it. Because of their problems, Hegel came up with the idea of dialectics, or as was later called, dialectical idealism, because of dialectical materialism. But dialectical idealism was arguing, or Hegel was arguing, that the ideal does come first, because he was a good Christian, and that's very important to this belief, but that the ideal comes first and creates the material conditions, but dialectically, there's a dialogue between the two. So the ideal comes first, but then the material world continues to shape how we think, and it's back and forth between the two. Marx, staunch atheist, again with the young Hegelians, they come up with this idea of dialectical materialism, so that the material world came first and then caused the metaphysical world. But then we already have these beliefs in religion, and that's going to cause change in the material world. So there still is this dialogue that they're keeping, but it just starts with the material world, as they really were those angsty 13-year-old atheists. I'm an atheist myself, but it's really, you read Marx's work, it's kind of the core of a lot of the things that he talks about in philosophy. He's like, well, religion is a social construct, therefore this happens, this happens, this happens. He doesn't even talk about the God debate. He comes in there presupposing that God does not exist, and then does his work based on that. Feel free to disagree. I'm not going to argue that here. Let's see. As Professor Wolf was talking, it's the dialogue between the two. But the material in the end is the most important. Material conditions do matter more. They're really what's causing the ideal in the end. So historical materialism, it's really a paradigm or a lens to view dialectical materialism throughout history, is basically what it is, as Dr. Wolf explains. Material reality shapes the way that people think, as I was mentioning. So here I have a couple examples. The wealthy think that the system is fair and that the workers are lazy. Well, the wealthy, as Marx would look at it, is, of course they don't, of course they think that they're right. They're the ones living in luxury. They're living a good life. They don't think, no one wants to think that they're lazy, So whether or not they've ever worked a day in their lives, the workers are lazy because they're not working hard enough to get where they are, is how he sees it. So their material conditions, so their lack of exploitation, they always have food to eat, all the entertainment they could want, leads them to believe these things about the proletariat, about the poor. So yeah, that's a historical materialism in action. And then on the other side, the poor proletariat, they're doing all the work, but they don't get all the food. And they see these people up here with all the food and no work. They're seeing, or they're then being led to revolution because they have poor material conditions. So then they think that that is what needs to happen, is revolution because of those material conditions. So that's historical materialism. We've got Marxism. Marxism is myself here. Marxism is essentially you think of his economic beliefs, of his critiques of capitalism, but as an ideology. So really, Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3 as an ideology, Marxism. So you've got capitalism is self-destructive. That's a core tenet. Because of this need for consolidation and competition, it's just going to eat itself up, he says. They're eventually going to run out of resources. Now, of course, space travel was not a concept for Marx at the time, so maybe he's wrong there. Maybe we won't run out of resources and competition will flourish into the interstellar age. But let's see, free competition, he says, presupposes the idea of winners. So then they trend towards consolidation and monopolies, as I kind of explained earlier. So these small businesses are going to keep eating at each other until you've got this oligopoly or monopolies running everything. He says that free competition creates that. You need regulation to stop that from happening. Talks about it again in Das Kapital. Lenin expands on that exact thing in Imperialism. He says that's why we're getting into all these wars. Is because of that need for consolidation. These imperialist nations need their companies to be able to expand into these third world nations, stuff like that. You see, oh yeah, and then the labor theory of value. Capital is nothing without the labor. That's where he gets all of this, these motivational talking points about the proletariat. You have nothing to lose but your chains. He's a real working man for a man that never really had a job himself. Funny enough, unless you want to call philosophy, his labor, but nonetheless, labor creates value, and that's a very core tenet of Marxism. Okay, yeah, so we've got Marxist philosophical opponents. This funny little graphic. So we've got Karl Popper. We talked about him in our philosophy class this year. Excuse me. He argues that Marxism is like a pseudoscience. Interestingly enough, I mean, Popper is pretty sympathetic to Marx's beliefs, but he believes that it's not a scientific method when you're looking back at history. Interestingly enough, I mean, he says that Marx did not make any predictions to be tested, and that it was weak for that. I would kind of disagree there. Not really going to go too much into it, but Marx is kind of known for having hypothesized a lot of things that ended up happening over the 20th century. There's a reason he's relevant today. But then he also criticized. Marx said that he was longing for freedom to rid us of these societal constraints, the social constraints, freedom for the proletariat, as necessitated or it necessitated a strong government and a regulation of business. So Popper, he's writing in a like Reaganomics era. So he's writing in the 70s and into the 90s, of how regulation on business is anti-freedom. Uh, so he's writing about all of this, but Marx wasn't arguing for freedom of business. He's arguing for freedom of the proletariat from business. Um, so Popper says that if you have a strong government, you can't have freedom. Marx disagrees with that, but Marx was dead 100 years before Popper was writing about him. So, anyways, Popper didn't really vibe with Marx as much. George Orwell, he's an anarcho-socialist. He opposed left-wing communism and authoritarianism. So he fought in the Spanish Civil War as a British man. He was part of the British Communist Party for a time. But then he fights in the Spanish Civil War. He is fighting as a member of the POUM, and there is basically infighting between the POUM and Stalin's army that was helping out in the Spanish Civil War. And so Orwell kind of has a change. He's like, okay, well, hold up, the communists are definitely the bad guys, because Stalin is fighting against the anarchists in the middle of a war against fascism, stuff like that. But where am I going with that? Oh yeah, so he's writing in a post-Stalin world. He writes of how liberalism is preferable to a Marx-inspired communist nation like the Soviet Union, and this is because the same things Popper was saying. He's saying, that in hyper-regulating businesses, you are, limiting freedom, essentially. So he writes about this in The Homage to Catalonia, Animal Farm, 1984. Yeah, pretty famously. Friedrich Nietzsche, I see a lot of things online saying that he's a big opponent of Marx. I couldn't find any direct ties. Maybe I'm completely missing something. I haven't read too much Nietzsche. I have some of his books, but they're incredibly complex and I don't understand them. So, but yeah, all I can really tell is that Marx is more saying that the material conditions are affecting the ideal. Whereas Friedrich Nietzsche, he kind of, and I should mention that they're both atheists, but Nietzsche is kind of arguing that it's these psychological causes that are affecting the material conditions. That's all I can really see. I don't see like a direct attack on Marx, but maybe it's there. Maybe I'm missing something. Let me know if you could. All right. Figures that were influenced by Marx. Yeah, right here's fun. Yeah, so you've got Lenin. Obviously, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is an author, lawyer, revolutionary, exiled to Germany by Tsar Nicholas. So he wrote a bunch of books, which I have a couple of them here. Basically inspired revolution when he returned to Russia during World War One. Bismarck actually sent him to Russia to inspire a revolution to get Russia out of the war. This is kind of funny. So Germany kind of created their biggest threat in World War II, which is really hilarious to me. But yeah, so Lenin obviously led the October Revolution, and that is a communist revolution, 100% inspired by the Communist Manifesto and also Lenin's "What Is to Be Done," which was spread out to the proletariat to inspire the revolution. He expanded on Marx's theory of consolidation of capital. He was again more into the economics than he was the more philosophical aspects. So like materialism. He obviously believed in conflict theory, spreading the Communist Manifesto, things like that. Gramsci's theory of hegemony, excuse me. Gramsci was writing about this in his prison notebooks. He was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist dictatorship during World War World War II, and actually most of his life. So because he sees it as such a problem, it can't be overcome by revolution. He argues that Marxists need to lead a passive revolution and live their lives through praxis. Um, he says that this was necessary to get rid of the hegemonic powers that Marx had theorized that revolution would take place as the world got more industrialized and they saw the income inequality. But Gramsci is living what 60 years after Marx's death, and he goes, okay, well, these revolutions are happening, but they're not really winning. And so hegemony is this theory of how the hegemonic powers stay in power, if that makes sense. Parenti, he's a professor, author, speaker, more modern day. I think he just turned 90 a couple weeks ago. He's a Marxist-Leninist that defends practicing communism as having bettered material conditions. He talks about this in The Black Shirts and Reds. He's got a good critique of corporate media, the freedom of media, except it's a for-profit corporation. So Marxist critique of the media. He uses, so as I was saying, he defended practicing communism. So he was writing during and after the Cold War. He's saying that during the Soviet Union, the Russian citizens were better off than they were before during the feudalist era, and after, immediately after, during Yeltsin's, capitalist era after the Soviet Union. So he argues, or he defends practicing communism, stuff like that, defends Marxist theories. He uses Marx's conflict theories in writing about past and present struggles. This can be seen in Parenti's To Kill a Nation, the bombing of former Yugoslavia in the 90s. Basically, kind of like we're seeing in Palestine and Israel, how there's just bombing of civilians by the colonial imperialist power. They're just bombing civilians, stuff like that. I'm not going to get into that. He uses a historical materialism to examine the reign and assassination of Julius Caesar, in Parenti's The Assassination of Julius Caesar. Go figure. He using historical materialism, and he looks at how Caesar was really like a populist figure, so we've got people like Cicero writing about how Caesar was power hungry. He was a dictator. Uh, what's ignored is he was given these dictatorial powers, and then what Caesar had been doing for Russia is he had suspended rent for 2 years. He suspended rent from the peasants. And so using historical materialism, you look back at it and you say, well, the aristocrats that murdered Julius Caesar, assassinated him, were landlords. They were landlords. So they were upset that, that power was being transferred from the aristocracy to the peasant class through use of a dictator. And so using historical materialism, as founded by Marx, Parenti explains that, sure, obviously Caesar, warmonger, still an imperialist, but with that dialectic, he looks at how he was bettering things for the proletariat, and because of that, the classes struggled, and there was the aristocracy, the senators murdered Julius Caesar for that reason. Here's why I agree with Marxist historical materialism. Concepts such as the winners write the history books. We hear that all the time, right? Except with historical materialism, it's more so the wealthy and the well-educated write the history books. So this is a big Parenti talking point, who I had just mentioned. Aristotle has a defense of slavery, but notably, the slave's views are absent from the debate. So we think about it, people say all the time, oh, it was a different time. In the 1700s, oh, slavery had been done for thousands of years. It's biblical. Aristotle defended slavery. Parenti mentions with this idea of historical materialism, the slaves weren't writing books. They didn't have the money to to lead this a life of philosophical work, because they're out on the fields, and they're not well educated enough to write about it. So you've got Aristotle saying that it's natural for them to be slaves, but really, he's defending slavery. This idea that it's natural, the defense of slavery, in it of itself, shows that there were people opposed to slavery over 2,000 years ago. So this idea that it was a different time, slavery was natural, was a normal thing, is completely ridiculous, in the fact that Aristotle had a defense for the practice. And then so you've got class struggle, unionizing led to the 40-hour work week, as I mentioned earlier, workplace safety, end of child labor, higher wages. These are all struggles that happened in the capitalist system, and really, I mean, feudalism taking over, or feudalism taking over, their kings and stuff like that, like Tsar Nicholas being overthrown by the revolution. It's a history of class struggle, and that's why I agree with Marx's historical materialism. Again, I already explained it, but Caesar's assassination by Parenti, more to do with historical materialism. Here's my works cited. All of the images in my PowerPoint I have linked in the comments per image, as to not muddy up this slide. But hopefully I didn't sound like a craziest communist nut. Thank you. That was my presentation on Karl Marx.